Okay, well, I want you to imagine for a moment that you are an archaeologist and you are leading a team searching for the oldest written documentary evidence for Christianity. So you're looking for the oldest manuscripts, the oldest writings, the oldest letters. So your team is in Egypt, and you are digging through the desert because in Egypt, the dry climate and the sands offer the best chance of preserving ancient papyri. So you are digging through a garbage dump in the ruins of an Egyptian village, and you come across some ancient papyri, clearly old, written in Greek. You translate it, you figure it out, and you realize what you have found is in fact a letter written by an old Christian. And as you read it, you find out, holy cow, you date this thing on the basis of the handwriting, and you realize this is undisputably first century, and you realize this is actually written by a Christian from the first century, and you realize this is the oldest writing ever found by a Christian. And as you read it, you realize this is written by somebody that knew the apostles themselves, and it actually claims in there that this person was an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus. Now imagine if you published these findings and Bible scholars and historians all around the world looked at that and said, yeah, that's actually legitimate. That's actually the oldest Christian writing ever discovered. And yeah, we agree. It's written by who it claims to have been written by. And it's the earliest piece of Christian writing ever discovered. Well, if you and your team found that, imagine the headlines. Oldest evidence for Christianity ever discovered. First century claim to have seen Jesus resurrected from the dead. Testimony vindicated by scholars universally. I mean, your career would be set, all right? You'd be giving interview after interview. You'd even have a Netflix documentary about something like that. It would be remarkable. Well, that evidence would have to be weighed very carefully by people investigating Christianity. Someone's thinking about becoming a believer, all of a sudden that would become a powerful piece of evidence that would be very intriguing. You as a Christian who is already a believer, you'd want to dig into that too because, man, that would be tremendously encouraging to find something like that. Now, what's interesting is we do have exactly such a letter. Actually, we have 7 of them. What's interesting about these letters is they are, in fact, our oldest Christian writings ever discovered. They're our oldest evidence for Christianity. They are, in fact, written by someone who knew the apostles. In fact, in these letters, it is claimed that that person is an eyewitness of the resurrection of Jesus. And in a very interesting twist, scholars around the world universally agree that these letters are legitimate. Yeah, those actually are written by the person whose name they bear. Now here's the crazy part. These letters remain largely hidden from us. We are largely unaware of these. Metaphorically, so to speak, they are still buried in the sand, for most Christians, still undiscovered. And even more strangely, these letters are hidden on your bookshelf, on your end table, in libraries, and in every church. Because these letters we are talking about are actually within our Bibles. But the significance of what they are and why is largely unknown to most rank-and-file believers. So this fall, we're going to dig into exploring particularly these 7 letters. We want to dig these 7 particularly out of this obscurity and highlight what makes them so significant for us as a solid foundation from which to explore and develop and argue for the truthfulness of the Christian faith. So I call these letters and this set of evidence the Undisputed Paul. But before I can explain what I mean by that undisputed Paul, we need to talk rather about our disputed Bible. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about, first, the value of doubt itself. So look at your little book I gave you of an outline this morning, or scroll down the endless page of the digital outline on the church app, and let's look at this together. So here's part 1, the value of doubt. Now, I've given you a big quote here from a very fine book that I would commend to you. It's called The Reason for God by Tim Keller. And this is right out of the beginning of the book. I'm not going to read all this, But you can read it on your own later. But look at the first paragraph. Well, second paragraph. He says, let's begin with believers. A faith without some doubts is like a human body without any antibodies in it. People who go blithely through life, too busy or indifferent to ask hard questions about why they believe, as they do, will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic. A person's faith can collapse almost overnight if she has failed over the years to listen patiently to her own doubts, which should only be discarded after a long reflection. He goes on, but notice that interesting point, that doubt can function in a way that actually in the end strengthens faith. Now, he goes on in the rest of the quote I gave you to turn to the person who is not a Christian and says, okay, fine. He encourages them to not forget to doubt their doubts. In other words, he says, if you doubt Christianity, make sure, whatever the standard of evidence you are asking for Christianity, make sure you are asking the same standard of evidence for your alternative views. So he speaks effectively and winsomely to both sides. Now, unfortunately, we Christians don't always respond well to the issue of doubt or people asking challenging questions. Many years ago, I knew a young person who grew up in the church, very gifted, sharp, godly person, but then went through a terrible experience of being harmed in a serious way by a Christian leader. And so unsurprisingly, this catapulted this person to a different trajectory, ultimately abandoning Christianity. But it also surfaced questions of doubt for this person. This person said this to me, and I'm paraphrasing. The person said, I've always received resistance for asking why. And all I want is to understand and know why I understand. I think blind faith is a crime. If you know why you believe, really know, then great. If you believe because your parents did or someone told you to, I think that's quite shameful. To give that much authority over your life should require a lot of explanation. And it was painful for me to hear that and to talk with this person because I'd spent a lot of time with them. But it was also painful for me to hear that this person had asked solid questions and had been shut down, like, we don't just believe. We don't ask those questions. Because that's a great way to help people leave Christianity. If all of this is true, then we can't be afraid of any question. We believe that Jesus came down and entered history. He was incarnated. He became a person. This isn't just myth. This actually happened in history. So this is an invitation, if you will, from God to test all of this historically. And if it's true, it should hold up. If not, it won't. So this fall, we want to think carefully about this question of, okay, doubt, but particularly this question of why do we believe that the Bible is true and that Jesus is who we believe he is? On what basis do we believe all this? Now, there's a lot of directions that answer can take, and we're not going to go over all of those directions, but this fall we're going to develop one particular line of argument which I think is effective and helpful. Keying in on these particular 7 undisputed letters that lay a secure foundation for us in our explorations of Christianity. And again, I'm calling all of this the undisputed Paul. But first we need to talk about the disputed Bible. So look at part 2. Turns out our Bible is very disputed. Probably unsurprising to you. Well, the Bible is a big book, but it's actually a bunch of little books put together. And it's essentially divided into 2 parts. There's the Old Testament, which comes first. This is the part of the Bible written before Jesus comes. And then there is the New Testament, which is the part of the Bible written after Jesus is here. And if you hold up a Bible and find the division, what you see is the Old Testament is way larger than the New Testament. So here's the numbers for you. The Old Testament actually has 39 different books in it, at least in our Protestant Bibles. Roman Catholic and Orthodox Bibles will have some extra books of the Old Testament. All churches are agreed on the New Testament, however. There are 27 books in the New Testament. So look at this first image on the screen. Let's look at the different kinds of books that are in the New Testament. First, in your New Testament, you have what we can call 5 books of history. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these are the Gospels. They're ancient biographies of Jesus' life. And then we have the book of Acts, which is a part 2 to the book of Luke. Okay, so we have these first. Our next section, as they are arrayed in our Bibles in the New Testament, are Paul's letters to individuals. We'll put those up there. So these are letters that the Apostle Paul wrote, and these are named based on where they were written to. So the Gospels up there, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're written based on who wrote them. Here on Paul's letters to churches, they're named based on where those letters were written. So the little letter of Galatians is written to a bunch of churches in the region of Galatia. Book of Romans is written to the church in Rome. Okay, then after this, we have Paul's letters that he wrote to individuals. His letters to individuals are after his other letters, and these now, in a little confusing twist, are named based on, no, it's not confusing, I'm sorry, it works the same. These are named based on who they were written to. So we have 2 letters to Timothy, we have a letter to Titus, we have a letter to Philemon. That's Paul's letters in the New Testament. The last chunk of letters you'll find in the New Testament, we'll call these general letters, and this is a grab bag of different writings from the early church. The book of Hebrews, we don't really know who wrote it, but it's written to a group of Jewish Christians, so it's called Hebrews. Then the next of the bunch of letters now, these are now named not based on where they were written to, but rather who wrote them. So 1st and 2nd Peter, named because they're written by Peter. Likewise, John, James, and Jude. And finally, at the end, we have the book of Revelation, which is a vision of the future, also written by the Apostle John. Okay, there you have it, 27 books of the New Testament. Now, it turns out that the majority of these books out there in the big wide world are disputed by scholars as to their authenticity. In fact, 20 out of these 27 books, many people out there will argue are not really written by the person they claim to be written by. Rather, many people will argue these are examples of what happened sometimes in the ancient world called pseudepigrapha, which means false writing. This was a problem in the ancient world. People would sometimes write in a later generation pretending to be someone from an earlier age to lend that writing authority and respect. So many will argue the majority here of these New Testament books are not really written by the people whose name they bear. Rather, they are written by Christians of a later generation writing under that name. So they will say, look, Gospel of Mark's not really written by Mark. Rather, this is a group of later Christians. They put this out, but they put Mark's name on there to lend it credibility. Likewise, Matthew, Luke, John. Not really written by John, many will argue. Okay, we have this challenge with 1st and 2nd Peter. James, debates over Revelation. And think about Paul's letters. It turns out 6 of Paul's 13 letters are heavily debated out there with scholars saying, yeah, 1st, 2nd Timothy, that is not really written by the Apostle Paul. It's written by a later Christian in Paul's name. Now, not all scholars believe this, okay? There are others that will argue, no, actually, all of the New Testament books are authentically written by the person whose name they bear. I would agree with that, okay? So I actually would say, no, we have good reason to believe and listen to the early church that all of these are really written by the person whose name they bear, but that is a topic for another day. Now, this fact, though, that the majority of our New Testament books, not to mention the Old Testament, are disputed in terms of authentic authorship, this can be discouraging, like troubling for us. Why bring this up? Well, that discouraging fact actually has a very fascinating and helpful corollary. So just like a black velvet backdrop makes the wedding diamond on the ring look even better, so too this alarming fact brings into very helpful contrast some good news that goes along with this. So here's part 3 on your outline. Again, the undisputed Paul. Paul's 13 letters in the New Testament. 6 of them are debated by scholars, with people arguing they're not really written by Paul. If you do some quick math, that means what? It means, interestingly, we have 7 letters of the Apostle Paul that are considered undisputed, that nobody questions is actually legitimately from the pen of the Apostle Paul in the first century. Here they are, your second bullet point. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon, circled here on your chart. Now this goes back to the mid-1800s. There was a famous skeptical German New Testament scholar named Ferdinand Christian Bauer. And he put forth an argument saying most of the New Testament books were forged. And he said back in the early days of the church, there was a huge fight between Paul and the Gentile Christians and Peter and the Jewish Christians, and it was never reconciled. They were permanently at odds, and much of the New Testament was written as a cover-up to hide this fact. So he argued Acts is bogus, you can't trust it, it's fake, trying to make it look like Peter and Paul got along in the end, but really they didn't. Well, he did put forward something, though. He said there are 4 letters of Paul that are undisputed. And the 4 that he put forward were Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. He said that's basically the only legitimate thing. He called these the head letters. He said these are the only letters written by Paul in the New Testament. The rest of them are covers-ups and scams. Well, scholars today largely don't follow Bauer's thesis anymore about the permanent rift between Peter and Paul. But one thing that was held on to and maintained was his observation that those 4 letters are undisputably authentic. So that observation has been continued. And in fact, over the years, in broad scholarship, 3 more letters have been added to that list. We have added Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. So these 7 letters out there in the big wide world are considered undisputably written by the Apostle Paul. And interestingly, this opinion is shared by scholars that are not Christians, who are atheists, or even enemies of Christianity. Here's some examples. First quote I've given you is by a New Testament scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman. He is a best-selling, top-notch New Testament scholar, written tons of books. However, he is not a Christian. He is an agnostic atheist, and he's done a lot to destroy the faith of many Christians. He wrote a book called Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. So Bart Ehrman is not our friend. He does not like Christianity. He is not a believer. But look what he writes nonetheless. I gave you a quote on your outline. He says, virtually all scholars agree that 7 of Paul's letters are authentic. Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. These 7 cohere well together and appear stylistically, theologically, and in most every other way to be by the same person. They all claim to be written by Paul. There's scarce reason to doubt that they are actually written by Paul. Another example, this is from Germany. This is Gerd Ludemann, a New Testament scholar who at one time was a Christian, went on to reject faith in Jesus, even penning and publishing a goodbye letter to Jesus. He was removed from his theology department where he was teaching. Look what Gerd Ludemann says. Again, not a Christian. He has no motive to try to prove that any part of the Bible is true. He writes this, however, of the 27 documents of the New Testament, 7 letters stem from Paul himself. So don't miss this remarkable fact. Yeah, there's debates out there about the authenticity of various Bible books. But what's so fascinating is that these 7 letters, nobody questions, really come from the pen of the first century Apostle Paul. And what makes this even more remarkable is that these are also the oldest writings in the New Testament. Paul's letters are the oldest Christian writings we have. You might say, well, wait, what about the Gospels? Like they tell the story of Jesus' birth and life. That's before Paul. That's true. And though the Gospels are talking about a time, about stuff that happened before Paul wrote his letters, the Gospels are not written down starting probably till the mid or late 60s after Paul's letters are written. So yeah, the Gospels are talking about an older time, but actually Paul's letters are written first. So Paul is our oldest witness to Christianity. These are our oldest Christian writings and evidence. And fascinatingly, these 7 nobody questions are really from the Apostle Paul. Well, this is what we want to dig in and focus on, particularly over the course of this fall, because this is a remarkable fact. It is really remarkable that there is universal agreement that these are legitimately from the Apostle Paul. Well, what is in these letters? Let's summarize some of the ground we will go over in the weeks to come. Here's part 4, the witness of Paul's undisputed letters. What do we find in here? So if this is a stable core for investigating the truthfulness of the Christian faith, what do we find? Well, here in summary form are some points that we'll continue to develop. First of all, these letters show Paul to be a former persecutor of the church who reversed his entire life when confronted with the risen Jesus. On your outline, I've given you from Galatians. Paul writes this, he says, "You've heard about my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles," and he goes on. So we see in these undisputed letters, Paul frankly admits, he says, look, I was once an enemy of Jesus, a violent man, a persecutor. But he turned around 180 completely. Paul went from being an enemy and a persecutor of the Christians to being a leader of the Christians and the greatest missionary we ever had. Well, what made that turnaround? Well, he tells us, he says, God revealed his Son in me. 1 Corinthians, he talks about that he was himself an eyewitness to the resurrected Jesus. So again, first century claim. Nobody doubts is really from the Apostle Paul. Paul says, I saw Jesus raised from the dead, and this is what made me change my life around. That's significant. These letters also show that Paul personally suffered greatly for following Christ and preaching the gospel. Look at these pictures. You will see in traditional old Christian art or statues of the Apostle Paul, you will see him holding what? A sword. Why? Not because he used it on people. This is an ancient Christian tradition in art to show martyrs holding the instrument of what killed them. So Paul is holding a sword because he goes on, we are told, to be beheaded under the reign of the Emperor Nero for his proclamation. He got it good. He got to get beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. That was a special privilege for Roman citizens. It's better than crucifixion or other options. So what's interesting is Paul suffered for this message. So look what he writes here. This is 2 Corinthians 11. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and day in the open sea. I've constantly been on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers. I've labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. So notice, he didn't lead the televangelist lifestyle of the big mansion, the private jet, and all the luxury. So notice, Paul was not getting wealthy from this life change. So actually, he suffered significantly for being a follower of Jesus. That adds credibility to the genuineness of his faith. And it points to the genuineness of that conversion experience that he tells us about. Well, what else do we see in these letters? These letters show us that he was close to the origins of Christianity, knowing the apostolic eyewitnesses. Paul moved in the circles of even the apostles who had been with Jesus, but Paul himself probably was not. That picture there is an inscription from the catacombs in Rome. This is an etching from an inscription, ancient Christian art of the apostle Paul and Peter together. Look what he says in Galatians, Paul. After 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, that's Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. So the apostle Paul spent 2 weeks with Peter there in Jerusalem. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God, what I'm writing is no lie. Skip some verses. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, meaning the Jews, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So we see from Paul's undisputed letters, he moved in the earliest circles of Christianity. Next point. These letters give us many glimpses into his heart and personality. Here's a 6th century mosaic of the Apostle Paul. So it's interesting, not only are these letters of Paul undisputed, I think it's fair to say, more than any other author of the New Testament, even, I think it's fair to say, I think it's clear, even more than any author of the Old Testament, so more than any other author of the whole Bible, the Apostle Paul, we can get to know, in a sense, through reading these letters. There's more of his personhood, more of his personality, more of his mannerisms, more of his heart that comes through, interestingly, even than any other writer of the New Testament. Lots of examples. I'm not going to read this whole paragraph. This is out of 1 Thessalonians. Look at the second paragraph. He says, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order to not be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel to you. You are our witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God who calls us into his kingdom and glory. Lots of examples we could look at. But you have the opportunity to know this individual in a way that you really don't with any other writer in the Bible. So one of the questions we want to ask as we go through this fall in this study, and one of the questions I would challenge you to think about as you read these letters is, do you trust the Apostle Paul? As you read these letters and get to know this person, what you see there, does that inspire confidence? Or you're like, yeah, I don't like this guy. Because Paul is such a key and early witness for us, one of the questions involved in the question, do you believe in Jesus? Do you trust in the Bible? Do you think Christianity is true? A big part of that actually involves this question of, do you trust the Apostle Paul? Do you have confidence in this person who is writing to you, in a sense, in these letters? And we can get to know him in a way we can't from any other Bible writer, I think. Well, these letters show supernatural gifts and authority, interestingly. Drop down to the end of that big paragraph. Here's 2 Corinthians 11 to 12. Paul says, I've made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you. I'm not in the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I'm nothing. Paul has come under pressure in the church in Corinthians by other Christians that have come along full of flash and powerful miracles and success, and they're demeaning Paul by contrast, saying he's very unimpressive. Look what he says in verse 12. I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. Now, Paul's making that claim writing to a contested situation where people are opposing him and claiming he's not effectively doing stuff like that. What that means is if Paul had really performed no miracles among the Corinthians, that would be a very dangerous and foolish claim to make. So that rings with quite a bit of credibility. Paul says, look, I performed miracles among you. Interestingly, I spent hundreds of hours trying to find any ancient document from anywhere close to our era where we have a first-person claim to have performed miracles where authenticity of the author is accepted. I can find no examples. This seems unique in the ancient world. Anywhere in the centuries around our era, to have a first-person claim to have performed miracles where the author of that document is accepted to be legitimate. This is a very remarkable claim. Imagine if we found a letter by Jesus, undisputedly written by him, where he talks about miracles he performed. Again, you'd be on the History Channel. Okay, so this is a remarkable claim. And Paul talks like that elsewhere as well. Well, look at the next point. We've introduced this to ourselves already this morning. These letters give us very early Christian tradition, predating Paul's letter themselves. Here's a painting of the Apostle Paul in the city of Ephesus in a cave from the 5th century. So Paul's our earliest Christian documents, but like we said earlier, Paul includes there early Christian tradition that predates even him. So Paul is like a time machine for us to the earliest Christians because his letters are written like in the, Galatians, probably 48, other letters in the 50s, and the latest ones in the early 60s. Okay, that's our earliest Christian documents. But when Paul does things like quote these early creeds, that's taking us back even farther. Like in the 1 Corinthians 15:1, he says to the Corinthians, okay, this is what I preached to you when I came there. So he writes this maybe in like 54 or something, but he's talking about several years earlier when he came to them in the early 50s. But then he says, this is what I received when I became a Christian. So he's talking about what he was taught when he first became a believer, probably just a few years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And that's that little creed. So this takes us back as early as it's possible to get, pretty much. So it's remarkable what is in these letters. Well, how about this? Number 5, devil's advocate. What if all we had was Paul's 7 undisputed letters? Let's just have a little exercise in imagination. What if we just threw out the whole Bible? Except these 7 letters of Paul. Maybe we said, you know what? Skeptics are right. Maybe none of the rest are legitimately written by the person whose name they bear. Now, it would be a terrible mistake to throw them away, because those, even if written under someone else's name, could contain true evidence and would be of great value still to witness to Jesus. But devil's advocate, let's say, if we threw out all the rest of the Bible, what would we have left? What's fascinating is the beliefs and doctrines of Christianity would essentially not change. So look at this list. Okay, it's on the screen. I put it on your handout. This is a list, partial, because I'm sure we could find more. This is a list of Christian beliefs that are taught in Paul's 7 undisputed letters. What do you notice? Pretty much anything you can think of is in there. Now, we'd be missing most of Jesus' teachings, which would be terrible, but we would still have the essential core of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. So pretty much every Christian belief would still be in there and be stable. Now, we are not going to throw out the rest of the Bible, but it's an interesting thought exercise to observe. Even if we did, Christianity would continue in its beliefs and teachings pretty much unchanged. Well, what's the bottom line for us? Let's put it this way. Explore carefully the evidence for Christianity, then commit to Jesus in faith. Explore carefully the evidence for Christianity, then commit to Jesus in faith. And this argument that we'll be developing, this is not all there is to say, okay? There's a lot more reasons we should be believing in Jesus. This is just one particular interesting line of argument, which I think is largely undeveloped. 3 suggestions. First, by recognizing the value in honest questions, but also remembering to doubt your doubts. Okay, it's good to ask questions. It's good not to just accept blind faith. But on the other hand, it's very easy just to lob doubts and accusations. Yeah, well, how do we know they wrote that? Yeah, well, I'm not convinced that's true. And sometimes, or most often, we don't hold the same standard of evidence to the alternative view. So I would encourage you, if you have doubts, fine, good, let's explore that. But don't forget to doubt your doubts, okay? Tim Keller's good on that if you want to read more. Second, by keeping in mind the key evidence from Paul, our earliest witness to Christianity. I keep that in mind. This is interesting. This is valuable. This is helpful. Our earliest Christian witness. And the heart of his witness, no one disputes, is really from the Apostle Paul. That's great. I like that. Third, by taking steps of commitment in line with the evidence, trusting in Jesus, whom Paul proclaimed. Our culture has a terrible definition for the word faith. Our culture thinks about faith as meaning faith with no evidence or faith against the evidence. It does not seem to be the Christian understanding of faith. Christian understanding of faith, it is a step of faith, it is a step of commitment, but it is a step of faith in line with where the evidence is taking you. There is a step of faith, but it's not a blind step of faith. It's not a step against the evidence. It is a step of faith in line with the evidence, just like if you were to take the step of faith to marry someone. Do you know they're never going to betray you? Do you know there's no skeletons in the closet? No, you don't. But hopefully you have a pretty good evidence pointing in the direction so that step of commitment is logical and reasonable. Well, again, for the sake of argument, what if we threw out all of the Bible, except for these 7 letters? Which we're not going to do, don't hear me wrong, and we shouldn't do that, and we won't. But even if we did, the core, the heart of Christianity would remain. Jesus and the gospel, and even if all we had was Paul, his witness to the good news of Jesus. So we're going to focus in on this. And along the way, you will have the opportunity, if you haven't done already, to make a new friend. And his name is Paul. Because you have a unique opportunity to get to know him in a way you will have not that opportunity for any other writer of the New Testament. So one of the questions you need to think through is, do you trust Paul? Do you accept his witness? Is this a person in whose voice you hear credibility or not? If the answer is yes, follow him. If the answer is no, don't follow him. But Paul would say, don't follow me, and stop there. He would say, follow me, as he says, as I follow Christ. Well, I've given you a fall reading suggestion down there, somewhere at the bottom of your outline. So these undisputed letters of Paul, if you put them all together, they have 61 chapters. So say we got 12 some weeks. If you read 5 chapters a week, you could easily get through all of these undisputed letters this fall. So that's what I'd suggest you do. Why don't you take 5 days a week, read 1 chapter a day, and just explore these 7 with us. And I'd recommend you read them in this order, which is probably the chronological order in which they were written, which means you would start with Galatians and end with Philemon. And just so you know, Paul's letters in the New Testament, the order they're in is just based on how long they are. So it's not a chronological order in the New Testament. It starts with the longest, going to the shortest, except Paul's letters to individuals are put last. Okay, well, if you have anything going on in your life that you could use prayer for, we'll have some members of our prayer team right over here after the service. Otherwise, we'll look forward to hanging out for a while after the service and talking. And again, if you are able to come back at 12:30 or so for our meal, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, go out into the world in peace and have courage. Hold on to what is good. Repay no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the afflicted, honor everyone. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit. And may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you always. Amen.